my brothers used to laugh at me. I want you to know that from the beginning, because I think it is important and because I think it says something true about the nature of what I am going to share with you today. They laughed with great affection. I want to be clear about that, but they laughed nonetheless. And the reason they laughed was always the same. It was because of a single word that I could not seem to stop using. A word that found its way into nearly every conversation I had, whether with the cardinal who occasionally passed through, or with the man who arrived at the door without shoes, whether with the mother who had brought a sick child, or with the businessman who had driven across the city in a car I could not have afforded in 100 years of priestly salary. The word was the same for all of them. And they would look at me sometimes across that little table near the door, and I could see them turning it over in their minds, trying to decide whether it was as simple as it sounded or whether there was something more inside it that they had not yet found. The word was appreciate. I want to spend our time together today going as deep into that word as I am able to go, because I have come to believe, not as a sentiment, not as a pleasant thought to carry into a difficult day, but as a serious and carefully considered conviction about the structure of the spiritual life and its relationship to the material world, that this single word contains more practical wisdom about money, provision, abundance, and the movement of God in human affairs than most people will encounter in a lifetime of reading books on the subject. I believe it is a key, not a metaphorical key, not a decorative key that sits on a shelf and is admired for its shape. A key that opens a real door behind which real things are waiting. Let me tell you how I arrived at this conviction, because I think the path matters as much as the destination. I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin, the sixth of 16 children born to Irish immigrants who had crossed the ocean carrying very little and arrived in a new country that was not always generous to people who looked and spoke as they did. My mother and father were people of extraordinary faith, not showy faith, not faith that announced itself in grand gestures, but the quiet, structural kind of faith that simply organizes a life from the inside out and determines, without drama, how a person responds to difficulty. I watched them every day of my childhood, and the thing I noticed most was not that they prayed, though they did consistently and genuinely, but that they gave thanks for specific things, for ordinary things, for the meal that was never quite as much as it could have been, for the weather that allowed the planting, for the children who were healthy that week when other families' children were not. My father had a phrase he used at table that I heard so many times it became part of the interior wallpaper of my mind. He would say, God has been good to us today, not God has been good to us now that the harvest came in, not God has been good to us now that the debt is paid. God has been good to us today on the day in question, with its specific contents, whatever those contents happened to be. And he meant it. It was not a polite formula. It was an actual observation about an actual state of affairs. On difficult days, on days when things had gone wrong in ways that genuinely cost the family, he still said it. And he meant it then too, because he had understood, in a way that I was only beginning to understand, that the goodness of God is not measured by the smoothness of your circumstances. It is a constant running beneath the surface of events, present regardless of whether the surface of events reflects it. I carried that understanding with me into the seminary, where I struggled badly and came close to failing on more than one occasion. I carried it into the Capuchin order, where I arrived older than most and less academically prepared than nearly all. I carried it through the ordination that gave me the title of simplex priest, a title that meant, in practical terms, that I was not fully equipped for the ministry as the church defined it. I was not permitted to preach formal homilies. I was not permitted to hear confessions. The two central activities of priestly life were closed to me by institutional decision, and I understood when I arrived at St. Bonaventure Monastery in Detroit that I would be spending my years answering a door. I want to tell you what I did in that moment, because I think it is directly relevant to everything I am going to say about money and provision and the movement of God in a life. I gave thanks. Not immediately. I want to be honest with you. It took some time. And there was a period in which the weight of what had been assigned to me was genuinely hard to carry. But I came through prayer and through the discipline my father had modeled for me at that table in Wisconsin to the place where I was able to look at the door in front of me and say, God has placed me here. This door, this hallway, this plain assignment, this is where he has put me. And if this is where he has put me, then this is where the provision is. This is where the work is. This is where the meaning is. And I gave thanks for it. What happened next is the part of the story I find most difficult to explain without sounding as though I am exaggerating for effect. So I want to say plainly, I am not. Within a relatively short time of my arrival at that door, people began to come, not to the monastery in the general sense, not to the superior or to the formal ministry of the community, but to the door. To me, word spread in the way that word spreads when something real is happening, not through advertising, not through any campaign of self-promotion, but simply because one person told another person and that person told someone else, he was helped. She found something there. Go and see. And they came, hundreds of them eventually, day after day after day, for more than 20 years. I tell you this not to speak well of myself. I was not the source of what those people found at that door, and I knew it then as clearly as I know it now. I tell you this because it is the most vivid illustration I have of the principle I am trying to share with you. When I stopped fighting the assignment and started appreciating it, when I moved from resistance to genuine, specific gratitude for the particular life God had given me rather than the life I had imagined for myself, something was released in that situation. Something became possible that had not been possible before. The door I had been given to open became, through appreciation, a door that changed lives, including my own. Now I want to move into the practical heart of what I want to say, because I think this principle applies with very specific force to the financial lives of the people listening to me, and I do not want to leave it in the realm of the spiritual autobiography. The word appreciate has two meanings that most people treat as separate, but that I have come to believe are deeply connected. The first meaning is the one we are all familiar with: to be grateful for something, to recognize its value, to acknowledge it with warmth and awareness. The second meaning is financial, and it is used almost exclusively in the context of assets and investments. When something appreciates, it grows in value. It increases. What was worth one thing becomes worth more. I do not believe this double meaning is accidental. I believe it encodes something true about the nature of gratitude and its relationship to material reality. The things we genuinely appreciate in the first sense tend, over time, to appreciate in the second sense. The relationship we invest with genuine recognition and warmth deepens and becomes more valuable. The skill we practice with genuine gratitude for the ability to do it grows and compounds. The resource we steward with genuine thankfulness for having received it tends to increase rather than diminish. This is not magic. It is not superstition. It is, I believe, a description of how the spiritual and material dimensions of human life actually interact with each other. Let me be concrete, because I think this principle is often discussed in ways that are too vague to be useful. Over 50 years of conversations at that door in Detroit, I sat with a very large number of people who were in financial difficulty of one kind or another. And I observed across those years and those conversations a pattern that was consistent enough that I cannot attribute it to chance. The people who were most chronically short of money, not temporarily short, but perpetually short, caught in a cycle that seemed to have no exit, almost universally shared a particular habit of mind. They spent the great majority of their mental and emotional energy focused on what they lacked. on the gap between where they were and where they believed they needed to be. On the bill that was due and the account that was insufficient and the plan that had not worked. This is understandable. It is a natural response to real pressure. When something is wrong, the mind goes toward it. When something is missing, attention is pulled in that direction. I am not blaming these people. I am describing a pattern that is almost universal in human beings under financial stress. And I have enormous compassion for everyone who has experienced it, because financial stress is genuinely painful and genuinely disorienting. But here is what I observed. This sustained focus on what was lacking had a very specific practical effect. It made people less capable of seeing and responding to what was actually available to them. The man who was consumed with what he did not have would sit across from me and tell me in great detail and with considerable anguish about everything that was wrong in his financial life. And as he spoke, I would sometimes notice things in his account of his situation, resources he had not thought to mobilize, connections he had not thought to ask, capacities he was not using, provision that was available to him if he turned in a slightly different direction that were invisible to him, not because they were hidden, but because his attention was entirely elsewhere, entirely pointed at the gap, at the lack, at the wrong. And the appreciation, the ability to see what was actually present and good and available had been crowded out entirely by the noise of the deficiency. This is one of the most important practical observations I made in all my years at that door. Gratitude is not merely a pleasant sentiment that makes a difficult life more bearable. Gratitude is a perceptual capacity. A person who is genuinely and habitually grateful literally sees more of their actual situation than a person who is not. They see more options. They notice more resources. They respond to more opportunities. The grateful person is not optimistic in the naive sense they are, not pretending the difficulty is not there. They are simply also seeing everything else that is there, which the anxious, lack-focused person is missing entirely. And I want to say this again because I think it is important enough to say twice. Gratitude is not a feeling that makes you more comfortable. Gratitude is a faculty that makes you more capable. The person who practices it seriously and consistently over time develops a genuinely different and more accurate picture of their reality than the person who does not. And from that more accurate picture, they are able to make better decisions, see better paths, and respond more effectively to the specific provision that God is always, without ceasing, making available to them. Now, I know that someone watching this is going to push back on that, and I want to address the pushback before it forms fully, because it is a fair one. You might say, Father, I understand the spiritual dimension of what you are describing, but I am not struggling to see opportunities. I am struggling because the opportunities genuinely are not there. The economy is what it is. The industry I work in is contracting. The bills are higher than the income, and there is no philosophical reframing that changes that arithmetic. I hear that. I have heard versions of it many times. And I want to respond to it carefully because I think there is something true in it and something that, with great respect, I believe is mistaken. What is true is that circumstances are real. The Great Depression that I lived through in Detroit was not a perception problem. Factories closed. Men who had worked their entire adult lives found themselves with nothing. The people who came to our soup kitchen door were not there because of a deficiency in gratitude. They were there because the structural conditions of their world had collapsed. Gratitude is not a substitute for structural remedy, and I would never suggest that a poor family in a failed economy simply needs to be more thankful. That would be a profound misuse of everything I am trying to say, but here is what I observed even in those most desperate years. Even within circumstances of genuine structural hardship, there was a consistent difference between the people who found their way through and the people who did not. And that difference was almost never about intelligence or effort or even opportunity. It was about the interior posture with which they met their circumstances. The families who maintained gratitude, who continued even in the worst of it to give thanks for the specific small things that were still good and still present, were the families who noticed the door that opened, who asked the right question at the right moment, who responded to the small movement of providence rather than waiting for a large and obvious rescue. Gratitude does not change the structural facts of your situation, but it changes your capacity to navigate those facts. And in a world where navigation matters, where the difference between two people in identical circumstances is so often the difference in how they move through them, that capacity is worth more than I can adequately express. I want to move now into the dimension of this that I find most spiritually significant, because I think it is the foundation on which everything else rests. And I do not want to build a house without showing you the ground it stands on. The deepest reason why gratitude is so powerful, in my understanding, is not psychological. It is not about perception or attention or cognitive framing, though all of those things are real. The deepest reason is this: gratitude is the correct response to reality. It is the accurate perception of what is actually true about human existence and its relationship to God. Everything you have has been given to you. The capacity to think that you are thinking with right now, given. The eyes with which you are receiving this, given. The breath that is moving through you as you listen, given. The relationships that have shaped you, the experiences that have taught you, the skills that provide your livelihood, given, not earned in any ultimate sense, not produced by the autonomous self that modern culture imagines you to be, received from a source that did not have to give them and that gives them continuously, moment by moment, without interruption. When a person truly understands this, not intellectually acknowledges it, but actually understands it in the way you understand something that changes how you live, several things follow. First, anxiety diminishes. Anxiety is, at its root, the fear that the provision will stop, that the source will dry up, that the good things that are present now will not continue to be present. But if you have genuinely understood that the source of the provision is not the economy, not the employer, not the investment market, not the plan you made 3 years ago, if you have genuinely understood that the source is a God whose generosity is not subject to recession and whose faithfulness does not depend on your performance, then the specific texture of your anxiety changes entirely. It does not disappear because we are human and our nervous systems respond to threat whether or not the threat is ultimate, but it loses its authority over you. It no longer runs the household of your interior life. Second, generosity becomes natural. This was something I watched consistently in the people who had genuinely entered into a practice of gratitude. They gave more freely, not because they had more to give, often they had less, but because gratitude had clarified for them that what passed through their hands was not originally theirs and was not ultimately being lost when they gave it away. The person who gives from a position of genuine thankfulness is not losing something. They are participating in the same movement of generosity that they have been receiving from. They are joining the current rather than daming it. And third, and this is perhaps the most practically significant, they began to see provision arriving in forms they had not recognized as provision before. This happened at my door so many times that I came to expect it. A person would come back weeks or months after our first conversation, and they would say, "Father, something happened." And as they told the story, what emerged was almost never a dramatic rescue from outside, a sudden windfall, an unexpected inheritance, a miraculous reversal of fortune. What emerged was a series of small movements, a conversation that led to something, a resource they had not thought to use that turned out to be exactly what was needed, a door that had seemed closed that opened quietly, without announcement. And when I asked them what had changed between then and now, the answer was almost always some version of, I stopped trying to force it. I gave thanks for what I had. I started paying attention to what was actually in front of me. This is providence. This is how it actually moves in most lives, most of the time. Not in thunderclaps, in quiet, specific, fitted movements that the grateful person can see and the anxious person walks straight past. I want to speak for a moment about the relationship between appreciation and enough. Because I think one of the most destructive beliefs that circulates in our culture, including, I am sorry to say, in some corners of religious culture, is the belief that contentment is the enemy of ambition. That if you are genuinely satisfied with what you have, you will stop working and stop growing and stop building. That appreciation is a recipe for stagnation. I watched the opposite. The people who were most deeply at peace with what they had, who had genuinely arrived at the conviction that what they had been given was sufficient for today, were, in my observation, the most effective workers and builders and providers, because they were not working from anxiety. They were not driving themselves forward with the whip of fear. They were working from a place of genuine purpose, genuine calling, genuine desire to use well what had been entrusted to them. And work done from that place has a different quality than work done from fear. It is more creative. It is more resilient. It recovers from failure more quickly. It maintains energy over longer periods. The person who works because they are terrified of lacking will exhaust themselves chasing a security that always retreats just ahead of them. Because security defined as enough accumulated to stop being afraid is a definition that can never be satisfied, the fear simply moves the goalpost each time it is approached. I have watched this happen in the lives of men who were wealthy by any reasonable measure and could not sleep, could not rest, could not stop calculating. The appreciation was missing. The enough had never arrived. And without the appreciation, the enough can never arrive, because no amount of accumulation will produce it. The appreciation must come first, not after, not as a reward for sufficient achievement. The appreciation must precede the abundance, because the appreciation is part of the mechanism by which the abundance flows. I want to close today with something personal, because I think the personal is where principles become real and the abstract becomes something you can actually carry into your daily life. I want to tell you about the last years of my ministry, when my health was failing and I had been moved from Detroit to a smaller house in Indiana to recover, though recover was perhaps an optimistic description of what my body was doing. I was in real pain much of the time. The work I had done for 20 years at the door in Detroit was no longer available to me. The people who had come to that door continued to write, and the letters arrived in great numbers, and I read them and I prayed over them and I wrote back when I was able. But the direct ministry, the face across the table, the handheld, the specific human presence of those encounters was largely over. And I want to tell you what I felt in those years because I think it is relevant. I felt grateful. I felt genuinely, specifically, and at times overwhelmingly grateful for the years at the door, for the people who had come through it, for the brothers who had become my family, for the faith that had survived everything my life had put it through, for the present moment, whatever that moment contained, including the pain. I had decided long before those final years that I was going to appreciate my life rather than audit it. And in those years, that decision was what held me upright. My final words, as I understand they were recorded, were these: I give my soul to Jesus Christ. That was the last thing I said before I left this world. I do not think those words were chosen. I think they were simply what was true of me in that moment, the natural expression of a life that had been, from beginning to end, an act of giving back what had been given. A soul that knew it had been received and was ready to be received again. That is the economy of appreciation. That is what the word contains for those who are willing to enter it fully. Not a technique, not a strategy, not a mental habit that produces incremental improvements in well-being. a fundamental reorientation to reality, a recognition that you are not the source, that the source is generous beyond accounting, and that the correct and the most powerful and the most practically effective response to that reality is the one my father modeled at that table in Wisconsin every evening of his life, and the one I carried imperfectly and by grace through 50 years of open doors and held hands and borrowed bread. Appreciate what God has given you, and appreciate the present moment in which you are living. Appreciate the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable grace of today, and watch carefully and without impatience what that appreciation begins to open in your life. Thank you for spending this time with me. If something in what I have said today has landed in a place that needed it, I would be grateful to hear it. Leave a word below. Share this with someone you know who is struggling to see what they already have. And if you want to continue this conversation, I hope you will subscribe to this channel so we can keep walking together. God bless you, and God keep everything that is yours.